November 22, 1963 is a date etched into history as the day America lost its innocence. But what if I told you that for the Vice President of the United States, that Friday in Dallas wasn't just a tragedy, but a miraculous escape from political execution? In the shadow of the grassy knoll, history has forgotten another story that was set to explode on the front pages of every newspaper in the country. A story involving a corrupted protege, a mysterious stereo system, illicit cash payments in the Senate, and a pending indictment that would have almost certainly removed Lyndon B. Johnson from the 1964 ticket and perhaps sent him to prison. Was the assassination of John F. Kennedy the only thing standing between LBJ and total ruin? Today, we are opening the sealed files on the Bobby Baker scandal. If you enjoy deep dives into history's darkest corners and want to support real investigative storytelling, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us uncover the truth. Now, let's go back to November 1963. To understand the sheer magnitude of the threat facing Lyndon Baines Johnson in the autumn of 1963, one must first look away from the sniper's nest in Dallas and focus on the smoke-filled backrooms of Washington, D.C., specifically the office of the Secretary to the Senate Majority, a man named Robert Gene Baker. History knows him as Bobby Baker, but in the corridors of power during the late 1950s and early 60s, he was known by a far more telling nickname, Little Lyndon. The relationship between Vice President Johnson and Bobby Baker was not merely professional. It was symbiotic, deeply personal, and structurally corrupt. Baker was the man who knew where the bodies were buried because, more often than not, he was the one digging the graves at Johnson's request. When Johnson was the Senate Majority Leader, arguably the most powerful man in Congress, Baker was his eyes, ears, and enforcer. They were so close that Johnson once told the press that Bobby Baker was his strong right arm, the last man he saw at night, and the first man he saw in the morning. This intimacy would become Johnson's greatest liability. By November of 1963, the walls were closing in. The general public remembers the assassination as a bolt from the blue, interrupting a standard political tour of Texas. This is a fabrication of nostalgia. The reality is that the trip to Texas was a desperate salvage mission. The Kennedy-Johnson ticket was fracturing. In Washington, a Senate investigation was rapidly peeling back the layers of a financial scandal that led directly to the vice president's door. The crisis began, as many political downfalls do, with something seemingly insignificant. It started with vending machines. A disgruntled contractor named Ralph Hill, who owned the Capitol Vending Company, filed a civil suit claiming that Bobby Baker had used his influence to cancel Hill's contract to service vending machines in an aerospace plant in Virginia. Hill alleged that Baker had done this to steer the business to a company in which Baker had a financial interest. In a town built on favors, this seemed minor, but discovery in a lawsuit is a dangerous thing. As investigators began to pull at this loose thread, the entire tapestry of Johnson's financial network began to unravel. What investigators found was that Bobby Baker, on a salary of roughly $19,000 a year, had amassed a fortune of over $2 million. He owned motels, stock in various corporations, and land. But the true danger wasn't Baker's wealth. It was the method of its acquisition and who else benefited from it. The Senate Rules Committee, under immense pressure, began hearings that were meant to be contained but quickly spiraled out of control. The most damaging testimony came from a man named Don Reynolds. Reynolds was an insurance agent and a former associate of Baker. His testimony was the smoking gun that aimed straight at the vice president. Reynolds testified under oath that he had been coerced by Bobby Baker to buy advertising time on a television station in Austin, Texas, KTBC. That station was owned by Lady Bird Johnson, the vice president's wife. This was a classic kickback scheme. If you want to do business in Washington, you pay the Johnson family in Texas. But Reynolds went further. He produced documents showing that in exchange for writing a $100,000 life insurance policy on Lyndon Johnson, he was forced to provide a gift to the vice president. The gift was a high-fidelity Magnavox stereo set, valued at $584, a significant sum in 1959. This wasn't a vague allegation of corruption. This was a tangible, traceable bribe. Reynolds testified that he purchased the stereo and had it installed in Johnson's private home in Washington. When the story began to leak, Johnson panicked. He issued a denial, claiming the stereo was a gift from the Baker family, but the paperwork held by Reynolds told a different story. The invoices showed the insurance agent paid for it. This stereo became the symbol of Johnson's vulnerability. It was the checkers speech moment, but Johnson had no way to talk his way out of it because the Senate investigators were not interested in excuses. They were finding a pattern of money laundering where cash was carried in envelopes between the Senate cloakroom and the vice president's office. But the scandal went deeper than financial graft. It ventured into the realm of moral turpitude and national security, areas that could destroy a politician's reputation overnight in conservative 1963 America. Bobby Baker had established the Quorum Club, a private hideaway in the Carroll Arms Hotel near the Capitol. It was a place where senators, lobbyists, and powerful men could drink and socialize with young women away from the prying eyes of the press and their wives. Among the frequent guests at Baker's parties was a stunning German woman named Ellen Romech. Romech was not just a party girl. She was the wife of a West German Air Force sergeant assigned to the embassy in Washington. However, FBI files later revealed that she had once been a member of a communist youth organization in East Germany. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, was investigating her as a potential spy. The implication was catastrophic. The vice president's protege was running a brothel of sorts that serviced U.S. senators and was infiltrated by potential Soviet bloc intelligence assets. While Hoover eventually expelled Romech to Germany to hush up the scandal, the whispers in Washington were deafening. The investigations were bringing all of this to the surface. By the morning of November 22, 1963, three separate major news organizations were preparing explosive stories. Life magazine, a titan of media at the time, had an investigative team that had been digging into Baker and Johnson's finances for weeks. They weren't just looking at Baker. They were looking at how Johnson, a public servant his entire life, had amassed a multi-million-dollar fortune. The editors at Life had scheduled a meeting for shortly after the Dallas trip to finalize a story that insiders believed would force Johnson to resign. The magazine had practically declared war on Johnson. Simultaneously, within the White House, the dynamic between the Kennedys and Johnson had reached a breaking point. It is a documented historical fact that Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, despised Lyndon Johnson. He viewed him as a crude, corrupt remnant of the old guard. The Baker investigation provided RFK with the ammunition he needed. The Department of Justice, under RFK, was quietly feeding information to the Senate investigators. They were weaponizing the legal system to excise a political tumor. Evelyn Lincoln, JFK's personal secretary, later wrote in her memoirs about a conversation she had with the president just days before the assassination. She asked JFK about the 1964 ticket. According to Lincoln, Kennedy stated that he was thinking of replacing Johnson. He mentioned Terry Sanford, the governor of North Carolina, as a possible running mate. The president reportedly said, he, Johnson, will not be on the ticket. Whether JFK would have actually followed through is a matter of debate, but the intent was there. Johnson was not paranoid. He was accurately reading the writing on the wall. He knew he was being pushed out. On the morning of November 22nd, Lyndon Johnson sat in his hotel suite in Fort Worth, Texas. Witnesses describe him as a broken man. His lawyer, John Connolly, was trying to cheer him up, but Johnson was despondent. He knew that back in Washington, the Senate Rules Committee was hearing testimony that morning. He knew that Don Reynolds was spilling the secrets of the insurance kickbacks. He knew Life magazine was printing the exposé. There are reports that Johnson told his mistress, Madeline Brown, the night before, that after tomorrow, those Kennedys will never embarrass me again. While that quote is often disputed and attributed to less reliable sources, the sentiment matches the reality of the political precipice Johnson stood upon. He was cornered. The Senate investigation wasn't going to stop. It was a runaway train fueled by his political enemies within his own administration. The specific mechanism of Johnson's potential imprisonment lay in the tax fraud implications. The Reynolds testimony opened the door to an IRS investigation. If it could be proven that Johnson accepted the stereo and the advertising buys as income without declaring them, which he hadn't, that was tax evasion. If it was proven they were bribes for political influence, that was a felony. Bobby Baker had already resigned in disgrace in October to try and shield his boss, but the shield was failing. Baker was keeping his mouth shut, playing the good soldier, but the paper trail was independent of Baker's silence. The checks, the invoices, the property deeds, they all existed. This was the atmosphere in the limousine as the motorcade turned onto Elm Street. Lyndon Johnson was 2 cars behind John F. Kennedy. He was a man staring into the abyss of a humiliating end to his career. He was facing the loss of power, the loss of reputation, and potentially the loss of his freedom. The Baker affair was front-page news in the New York Times and the Washington Post that very week. The Senate committee was demanding answers. And then, at 12:30 p.m., 3 shots rang out. In the chaos that followed, the trajectory of history snapped. But what happened to the investigation? What happened to the Life magazine story? What happened to Don Reynolds? The moment Kennedy was pronounced dead, the political landscape shifted tectonically. The investigation into the new President of the United States could not proceed in the same manner as an investigation into a disgraced Vice President. The national trauma required unity, not division. But the silence that descended over the Bobby Baker scandal in the weeks following the assassination was not merely a product of mourning. It was a deliberate, calculated suffocation of the truth. As we move into the next part of this investigation, we will look at exactly how the machinery of the government halted immediately after the shooting, how witnesses were intimidated, and how the media was silenced. We will examine the strange actions of the Senate Rules Committee in December 1963 and how Lyndon Johnson used his new executive power to bury the evidence that could have put him in a cell. The bullet that killed JFK didn't just end a presidency. It killed the case against LBJ. The silence that fell over Washington, D.C. in the days following November 22, 1963 was heavy, suffocating, and orchestrated. While the nation wept for John F. Kennedy, a different kind of activity was taking place inside the J. Edgar Hoover building and the closed-door chambers of the Senate. The Baker affair, which had been a roaring fire threatening to consume the vice presidency just 48 hours prior, was about to be extinguished with a precision that suggests a predetermined containment strategy. The death of Kennedy did not just change the occupant of the Oval Office. It fundamentally altered the legal reality of the United States. Lyndon Johnson was no longer a vulnerable vice president subject to the whims of Senate committees and the Department of Justice. He was the president, and in the logic of statecraft, the president cannot be a criminal. To indict the president during a time of Cold War crisis would be to destabilize the nation itself. Johnson, a master of political leverage, understood this better than anyone. He used the tragedy as a shield, and the first casualty of this new order was the truth about Bobby Baker. The immediate pivot of the media is the first smoking gun of the cover-up. As detailed previously, Life magazine was days away from publishing an investigative report that connected Johnson directly to Baker's illicit financial network. The reporters had done their work. The sources were vetted. The story was ready to print. Yet, in the week following the assassination, the story vanished. It was not merely postponed, it was spiked. Johnson, utilizing his new authority, reached out to the publishers of major media conglomerates. He appealed to national unity. He argued that digging into the financial history of the new commander-in-chief while the Soviet Union watched for weakness would be unpatriotic. The publishers, caught up in the patriotic fervor and the solemnity of the moment, acquiesced. The investigative team at Life was told to stand down. The aggressive journalism that had been hunting Johnson was replaced by puff pieces designed to reassure a frightened public that the government was in steady hands. The free press, usually the check on power, became an accomplice to the silence. However, the Senate investigation could not be simply wished away. It had to be actively neutralized. This is where the alliance between Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, became the defining force of the era. Hoover and the Kennedys had despised one another. RFK, as Attorney General, had tried to rein in the FBI director. Johnson, conversely, was Hoover's neighbor and longtime political ally. With Kennedy dead, Hoover was off the leash. Almost immediately, the FBI's role in the Baker investigation shifted from gathering evidence to destroying witnesses. The target was Don Reynolds, the insurance agent who had testified about the stereo kickback. Reynolds was the loose thread that could unravel the presidency. He had to be discredited, and the methods used were brutal. In the weeks following the assassination, confidential FBI files concerning Don Reynolds were leaked to the press. These files contained salacious, unverified, and irrelevant details about Reynolds' past, designed to paint him as unstable and untrustworthy. Drew Pearson, a powerful columnist and a close friend of LBJ, began writing hit pieces on Reynolds, using information that could only have come from sealed government dossiers. The message to other potential witnesses was clear: if you speak against the president, the government will destroy your reputation. But the intimidation went beyond headlines. Reynolds testified that shortly after he spoke out, a jar of sludge was thrown through his window. More chillingly, he reported finding a dead cat on his doorstep, a classic, visceral warning signal often associated with organized crime. The message was received. The Senate Rules Committee, now sensing the change in the wind, began to treat Reynolds not as a whistleblower, but as a defendant. They aggressively questioned his character rather than investigating the evidence he provided. The Senate Rules Committee itself underwent a transformation. Prior to Dallas, the Republicans on the committee were eager to tear into the vice president. After Dallas, the Democratic majority, led by Senator B. Everett Jordan, clamped down. The investigation was redefined. It was no longer an inquiry into the vice president's business dealings. It was strictly limited to Bobby Baker's personal misconduct. A firewall was erected. Any question that sought to link Baker's activities to Johnson was ruled out of order. When Republican senators tried to introduce evidence of Johnson's involvement in the Quorum Club or the intricate land deals, they were shut down by the chairman. The logic was circular and absolute. Johnson was not on trial. Therefore, evidence about Johnson was irrelevant. The investigation, which was hemorrhaging on November 21st, had been cauterized by December 1st. Behind the scenes, Johnson's personal lawyer, Abe Fortas, a man who would later be nominated to the Supreme Court, worked tirelessly to manage the legal fallout. Fortas was the architect of the Stonewall. He coordinated with Baker's defense team to ensure that Baker did not cut a deal. This was the greatest risk. If Bobby Baker, facing prison time for tax evasion and fraud, decided to flip on Johnson to save himself, the presidency would be in peril. Baker, however, remained loyal. He understood the code of the Senate. He knew that if he kept his mouth shut, he would eventually be taken care of. But if he talked, he would be destroyed. Baker maintained a stoic silence, refusing to implicate the leader, as he called Johnson. In exchange for this silence, the White House ensured that the prosecution was limited in scope. Baker would eventually go to prison, yes, but for a relatively short time, and for charges that did not touch the president. It was a transaction, Baker's liberty for Johnson's presidency. Another critical aspect of this cover-up involves the frantic cleaning of the paper trail within the executive branch. There were documents linking Johnson to Baker in the files of the vice president's office. In the chaotic days of the transition, as Johnson moved into the Oval Office, his staff had unprecedented access to purge records. We know from historical accounts that there was a massive movement of files during this period. The blind trust that Johnson set up for his assets was another mechanism of obfuscation. By placing his business interests, including the television station KTBC, into a trust, he created a legal fiction that he was no longer involved in their management. Yet, the station continued to profit immensely from favorable rulings by the FCC, a body appointed by the president. The corruption didn't stop. It just became institutionalized and protected by executive privilege. The psychological impact on Robert Kennedy during this period cannot be overstated. RFK had been the driving force behind the investigation into Baker. He saw it as the tool to remove Johnson from the ticket. With his brother dead, RFK lost not only his emotional anchor, but his political leverage. He was still the Attorney General, technically the head of the Justice Department, but he was now serving a man he hated and who he suspected of being the beneficiary of his brother's murder. RFK watched helplessly as the FBI, technically under his command, bypassed him completely to report directly to the White House. Hoover stopped taking RFK's calls. The investigation into Baker was taken out of the Justice Department's hands effectively, managed instead by Johnson's cronies. RFK later admitted to friends that the Baker thing was dead. He knew he couldn't pursue it without tearing the country apart, and looking like a vengeful sore loser. Johnson had won. There is a specific, documented incident that highlights the absurdity of the cover-up. In January 1964, the Senate Rules Committee finally called witnesses regarding the allegations that Baker had arranged party girls for politicians. This was the Romech scandal. But instead of a public hearing, the testimony was taken in secret. The transcript was sanitized. The names of high-ranking officials were redacted. The committee concluded that there was no evidence of a security risk, despite the FBI's own files indicating Romech was a potential East German asset. Why? Because exposing the security risk would mean exposing the Quorum Club, and exposing the club would lead back to Johnson's inner circle. The national security of the United States, the potential infiltration of the Senate by Soviet agents, was compromised to protect the reputation of Lyndon Johnson. The narrative that emerged in 1964 was that Bobby Baker was a rogue operator, a bad apple who had deceived an unsuspecting and trusting Lyndon Johnson. This narrative was absurd to anyone who knew how Johnson operated, a man who micromanaged every detail of his staff's lives. But it was the only narrative the establishment would allow. The media, the Senate, and the FBI cooperated to sell this lie to the American public. The Baker scandal was successfully amputated from the body politic. Johnson went on to win the 1964 election in a landslide, his corruption buried under the weight of his Great Society and the escalating war in Vietnam. But the ghost of the scandal never truly vanished. It remained in the archives, in the redacted FBI files, and in the bitter memories of men like Don Reynolds, whose life was ruined for telling the truth. As we move to the final part of this investigation, we will examine the long-term consequences of this cover-up. We will look at how the suppression of the Baker scandal created a template for the Johnson presidency, a presidency defined by secrecy, the manipulation of intelligence, and the destruction of dissent. We will also explore the eerie connection between the lawyers and fixers who saved LBJ in 1963 and the scandals that would eventually consume the country years later. The cover-up of 1963 didn't just save Johnson, it corrupted the soul of Washington for a generation. If the weeks following Dallas were about immediate damage control, the years that followed were about burying the bodies, both figuratively and, according to some evidence, literally. The Bobby Baker scandal did not end with the Warren Commission report or the 1964 election landslide. Instead, it metamorphosed into a dark undercurrent that ran beneath the entire Johnson presidency. To fully understand the magnitude of what was saved by the bullets in Dealey Plaza, we must look beyond the Senate cloakroom and into the dusty fields of Texas, where the intersection of Lyndon Johnson's financial desperation and absolute power produced consequences far grimmer than tax evasion. While Bobby Baker was the face of the scandal in Washington, he was merely one head of a hydra. The other head was a Texas businessman named Billy Sol Estes. The relationship between Estes, Baker, and Johnson is the key to understanding the deep politics of the era. Billy Sol Estes was a cotton and grain magnate who had built a fraudulent empire based on non-existent fertilizer tanks. Like Baker, he was a financier of the Johnson political machine. But unlike Baker, the Estes affair had a body count. We cannot discuss the salvation of LBJ without discussing the death of Henry Marshall. Henry Marshall was a Department of Agriculture official who, in 1961, began investigating Billy Sol Estes's fraudulent schemes. Marshall was a dedicated public servant who refused to be bribed or intimidated. On June 3, 1961, Marshall was found dead on his farm in Texas. He had been shot 5 times with a bolt-action rifle. In one of the most absurd rulings in American forensic history, the local sheriff, a political ally of LBJ's machine, ruled the death a suicide. The ruling defied physics. A man shooting himself 5 times with a rifle that required manual reloading between each shot. For years, this death was a whispered rumor in Texas, a terrifying example of what happened to men who looked too closely at the vice president's friends. After the assassination of JFK, as the Baker investigation was being dismantled in Washington, the Estes/Marshall case was simultaneously contained. Had the Baker scandal exploded in late 1963 as planned, the media would have inevitably pulled the thread leading back to Estes and Marshall. The spotlight would have turned to the suicide in Texas. JFK's death prevented this convergence. It wasn't until 1984, long after Johnson's death, that Billy Sol Estes finally testified before a grand jury. He stated under oath that Lyndon Johnson had ordered the killing of Henry Marshall to prevent the exposure of the fraudulent network that funded his political rise. While these allegations came from a convicted con man, the forensic evidence, later revisited, confirmed Marshall was murdered. The Baker scandal was merely the tip of an iceberg that involved murder, fraud, and a level of corruption that makes Watergate look like a petty burglary. But what became of Bobby Baker himself, the man who held the keys to the kingdom? His fate is a masterclass in the limited hangout strategy. The Justice Department, now firmly under the thumb of the Johnson White House, delayed the indictment of Baker until well after the 1964 election. This ensured that Johnson faced no embarrassment at the polls. When Baker was finally brought to trial in 1967, the charges were carefully curated. He was indicted for tax evasion, theft, and fraud, crimes presented as the actions of a greedy individual, entirely separate from his work for the Senate Majority Leader. The prosecution did not ask about the cash in the vice president's office. They did not ask about the Romej spy ring. They did not ask about the stereo. Baker was convicted and eventually served 18 months in federal prison. It was a slap on the wrist for a man who had stolen millions and compromised national security. But his silence had been purchased. Throughout his trial and imprisonment, Baker never implicated LBJ. Years later, in his memoirs, Baker admitted that he felt he had no choice. He knew the power of the man in the Oval Office. He knew what happened to people who talked. In a chilling interview later in life, Baker remarked that he was holding the bag for Johnson, but that he understood the rules of the game. The Baker defense, silence in exchange for survival, became the unwritten rule of the Johnson administration. The cultural impact of this cover-up on Washington, D.C. was profound. The suppression of the Baker story signaled the end of a certain type of innocence in American journalism and governance. The reporters who had been aggressive in 1963 learned a hard lesson. The president is untouchable. The investigative team at Life magazine was disbanded and reassigned. The aggressive pursuit of executive corruption was replaced by a deferential court journalism that would not be broken until the Pentagon Papers and Watergate a decade later. In many ways, the failure to expose LBJ in 1963 emboldened the executive branch to commit greater overreaches. The same lawyers who helped bury the Baker scandal, men like Abe Fortas and Clark Clifford, became the architects of the Vietnam War's expansion. They operated with the belief that the truth could be managed, that facts could be redacted, and that the public could be kept in the dark indefinitely. There is a tragic irony in the legacy of Lyndon Johnson. He is remembered as the architect of the Great Society, the man who passed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. He used his immense legislative skill, honed in those same backrooms with Bobby Baker, to push through legislation that changed America for the better. Yet, the foundation of his presidency was built on a lie. He entered the Oval Office not by the mandate of the people, but by the chance of an assassin's bullet that saved him from a prison cell. This duality haunted him. Audio tapes from the Johnson White House, released decades later, reveal a man consumed by paranoia. He was obsessed with leaks. He was terrified that the Kennedys were plotting his destruction even from the grave. In conversations with his aides, Johnson frequently alluded to the mess he inherited and the secrets he had to keep. He knew that his legitimacy was fragile. Why did Johnson abruptly decide not to run for re-election in 1968? Historians cite the Vietnam War and his failing health. But deep political researchers suggest another factor, the fear that the dam was finally breaking. By 1968, the whispers about the Baker/Estes affairs were resurfacing. Robert Kennedy was running for president, and this time, he wouldn't be stopped by a national unity plea. Johnson's withdrawal was the final act of self-preservation. The Bobby Baker scandal is not just a footnote in history. It is the what if that defines the second half of the 20th century. If Kennedy had not been killed, the Life magazine story would have run on roughly November 29, 1963. The Senate hearings would have resumed with Don Reynolds' testimony on national television. The calls for Johnson's resignation would have been deafening. He would likely have been dropped from the 1964 ticket and quite possibly indicted for felony bribery and tax fraud. There would have been no President Johnson, no Gulf of Tonkin resolution. The trajectory of the Vietnam War would have been radically different. The civil rights movement might have faced a different legislative path. Instead, 3 shots in Dallas changed everything. The investigation stopped. The witnesses were silenced. The files were sealed. And the man who was staring at political ruin became the most powerful man on earth. The story of Bobby Baker serves as a grim reminder that history is not always shaped by the triumph of good over evil, but often by the terrifying luck of the corrupt. The fingerprint of the hitman, the bullet on the stretcher, and the stereo in the vice president's living room, all disparate pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, reveal a picture of a democracy hijacked by its own darkest secrets. Ultimately, the question, did JFK's death save LBJ from prison, can be answered with a resounding yes. The timing is too precise, the suppression of evidence too systematic, and the relief of the Johnson camp too palpable to conclude otherwise. The death of one president was the life support for the next, and in the silence that followed, the modern American surveillance state was born, built to ensure that such a close call would never happen to a president again.